and welcome to Worlds Apart. From stability to liability, Turkey, the once shining beacon of Muslim democracy, seems to have lost at least some of its policy bearings both at home and abroad. How did its zero problems with neighbors policy turn so quickly into zero neighbors without problems? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Norman Stone, a professor in the Department of International Relations at Bilkent University in Ankara. Professor Stone, it's such a great pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Now, what's interesting about your background is that you're a scholar of Russian, Turkish, and European history, and these three have always been in some sort of a love-hate triangle, but now it seems we came to the point where they all just hate each other, but have to restrain themselves for the fear of all hell breaking loose. Why are these relations so dysfunctional?
I mean, I think from the Turkish perspective, Turkey has started pursuing an aggressive foreign policy, which she didn't do at all until just a few years ago. And the Turks were always very, very careful not to provoke trouble with Russia. And you know what's going on with the Europeans? All this involvement with the Ukraine is something which I suppose really boils down to a kind of European attempt to take over the Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Well, it all seems like a perfect storm, that all the events coming up together at the same moment of time in history. You mentioned Turkey, and what I think is very interesting about it is that for a while at least, everything was going very well for Ankara. I mean, its economy was booming, its standing in the world and in the region was rising, and it also managed to develop very accommodating, I think, relationship with its old foes like Russia and Iran. Then Syria came along and it all just went downhill. Do you think the Turks really understood what they were getting into in Syria?
No, do you know, I think that's a part of the problem, that this present government was so impressed by its own success, and it did, as you say, it did do remarkably well, that it thought it would be a formula you could apply to other parts of the Ottoman Empire, and the part which is closest to Turkey in a way is, of course, Syria. Mm-hmm. And it looked as if you could get, you know, a moderate Syrian opposition. Perhaps Assad would make the necessary concessions, and then you would get a kind of a government rather similar to the present one in Turkey coming up. Of course, it was a fantastic miscalculation. And Assad himself said at the time, look, if you touch Syria, it's a powder keg. It'll blow up and affect everybody.
Mm-hmm. And what is shocking to me personally is that, you know, I reported a lot from Syria in the beginning of that war, particularly from Aleppo. And Aleppo used to be an amazing city that rose economically on the shoulders of Turkish businesses. I mean, they were everywhere, and yet everything was thrown under the bus. I mean, we are talking about billions of dollars in lost investments. We are talking about billions of dollars in added costs to care for the refugees. What do you think is the Turkish calculus here? What possibly could be worth all those losses and sacrifices?
I think it was simply miscalculations. And then, you know, there's another aspect to things that if you're that kind of Turk, you know, you're used to thinking, well, you know, I'm regarded in this country as an inferior being because I'm religious, or at least religious of that sort. And then suddenly they become more successful, really, than any of their rivals had ever been. And I think it went to their heads. I mean, they are, after all, you know, a lot of them are just, you know, provincial people from the Black Sea coast. Mm-hmm. Or a lot of them are Kurds as well. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's well, you know, provincials getting frogs trying to turn themselves into bulls, I think, in this foreign policy business.
You made an interesting point in your recent op-ed in The Guardian that the foreign policy of the current Turkish leadership represents an extraordinary departure from the prudent tradition of Turkish foreign policy. And I find this word prudent very interesting because everybody from Obama to Merkel to Putin to indeed Erdogan have sworn to engage in what they believe prudent policy is. But I think some of them at least have, well, probably not managed to live up to it. Is it even possible to exercise prudence in that region today?
The Turks would have had to do it because, I mean, they know the region. They know it's going to blow up and how difficult it all is. And all my Turkish friends absolutely opposed the Second Iraq War. They said it's a terrible mistake going in. I was in favour of it at the time, more fool me. And I think this government just got the bit between its teeth, and that, you know, we can come in as the great, you know, the great Muslim moral saviour for this benighted region, and it went to their heads. And then the other side of it is, of course, instead of recognising that they'd made a mistake, they went on, and the civil war in Syria simply got worse. It's you know, they were very obstinate about it. I think they should have looked at the lessons of their own past and stayed out of these things.
Well, and as you said, they went on and on and on. And, you know, one of the moves that Turkey has never done was to directly challenge Russia, as you pointed out just a minute ago, by downing the Russian bomber. One popular theory here, at least in Moscow, is that Erdogan was just losing his patience and he wanted some dramatic move to allow him to change the course of events quickly. In your view, how much of it, what we are talking about now, how much of it is due to personal psychology, personal views, and how much of it is policy?
I think a lot of it must be personal. And you know, don't forget that the present Prime Minister, Davutoglu, had also you know, pledged his credit to this kind of foreign policy, as if, and it's something which that particular party has taken up a long time ago. I remember there was a wonderful moment when Erdogan's predecessor Erbakan, who was the representative of the religious party in the 1990s, and he became through some political calculation prime minister. And he immediately started saying, oh, we'll set up a D8, which will be the economic equivalent of the G7 for the Muslim countries. And they were all going to have a joint foreign policy. And he organised in Libya with Gaddafi a meeting of various Muslim heads of state, thus some gorilla-like creature from Chad, and the Iranians chipped in, and various others of that sort. And Gaddafi started saying that the Turks were persecuting the Kurds, and of course the Turks then had to walk out, collapse of Islamic foreign policy. But I didn't take these things seriously at the time. I thought they were a joke. I mean, what's a country like Turkey, a country who's really westernized to such an extraordinary degree now, taking up this kind of religious fantasy? But they seem to be going on with it. You know, it'll be all Muslims together. And then, of course, you know, what the latest is that Turkey more or less got expelled from the Arab League because of the troops in Iraq. I mean, the thing is very nearly farcical, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's very, very complicated in a sense that, you know, they broke ranks with some of their former allies, but they also gained, you know, new friends and enemies, new friends rather, in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and some of the even more unsavory factions on the ground in Syria and Iraq.
Well, thank you.
Well, I remember in one of your lectures, you said an interesting thing about the Soviet Union. You said that political analysts failed to see the collapse of the Soviet Union coming, but historians knew that sooner or later some change will have to take place. Given how much you've written about Turkey, do you think the trends that we are discussing at the moment, political, religious trends, do you think they are more transient, or do they have a sort of permanent potential?
Well, and I think in this case, it's a kind of religious fantasy that you know, you can apply, you know, Quranic prescriptions to things, and I mean, half the country hates it. It hates being told that it can't have a drink when it wants to have a drink in a restaurant which is willing to serve it, and to have this kind of thing going on is tiresome. And at a certain point, these fantasies explode.
Absolutely, Professor Stone, but you know, you mentioned that half of the country hates it, and having family in Turkey, I know that half of the country also hates seeing, you know, Syrian refugees in such large numbers in many cities around Turkey, not only in the east or the south, but also in Istanbul and Eskişehir and so on and so forth. But there is also a very, very strong base for Mr. Erdogan's policies, and that base seems to be more convinced than ever that he is the right leader for the country.
Well, yes, and I mean, you know, if you go to places like Trabzon or Trebizond, you can see the popularity of the regime. You get to the airport, there's a vast photograph of Erdogan, and it reads, "The Businessmen's Association are so grateful to you for getting us back to our roots and making us walk tall again," this sort of vocabulary. And oh, by the way, thank you for letting us build that stadium here. And they filled the place with concrete. In my opinion, they've ruined the town. It used to, I mean, it's one of the best places on the Black Sea. But if you ask ordinary people how they live, there are two things that obviously influence them more than anything else. The first is health. And that is 80% of the population is affected by how the state handles health. And there they have done far better than any previous government. And the other thing is housing. You know, so many of these Turkish cities had clapboard houses with round about them in great numbers. They're called gecekondu. And this government have made a very creditable show at putting people into decent housing.
Absolutely, absolutely. But Professor Stone, isn't it also the case that it is to some extent the leftovers of former successes, both the health system and the housing success? Because with the influx of more than 2 million refugees into the countries, both the health system and the housing system are under enormous duress, not to mention that the budget is also experiencing a substantial pressure from that.
I can't imagine what it's like in places like Antep at the moment. I think the real strain is coming with education, I think. And there are hundreds of thousands of Syrian children who can't go to school. And of course, the pressure on employment is another thing. I mean, you know Turkey, obviously, and there's an awful lot that the Turks will put up with. But it's obviously under terrible strain at the moment.
Well, Professor Stone, we have to take a very short break now, but when we come back, U.S. Vice President Joe Biden paid an official visit to Istanbul this week to discuss joint efforts in the fight against Islamic extremism. Isn't it a bit like letting the fox guard the henhouse? That's coming up in a moment on Worlds Apart. Stay tuned.
Uncovering hidden stories, moving against the mainstream, going to all lengths to bring real news to Britain. I'm Afshan Ratansi, going underground to bring you the stories that really matter, only on RT.
Welcome back to Worlds Apart. We are discussing Turkey's dramatic transformation, both domestically and internationally, with Norman Stone, a professor in the Department of International Relations at Bilkent University in Ankara. Professor Stone, I mentioned Biden's visit to Turkey, and officially, at least, it was intended to discuss joint efforts to fight ISIS. And what's interesting about the American proposal is, rather than making some general statements, Washington, for the first time, is offering Ankara concrete solutions. They're offering them technology that would enable Turkey to close its border with Syria. Isn't that an indicator, perhaps, that Ankara's notion of what it means to fight ISIS is very different from what Washington means by it? Do you think they see this issue in the same sort of light?
No, I'm pretty sure they don't. I mean, the Turks very obviously, at least the Turkish, the people in charge, obviously thought that ISIS was, in a sense, the lesser evil. They went, and finally they went along with it, with doing something against it. But I don't think their hearts were ever in it particularly.
Well, I think they're taking some measures now to seal the border, and that will perhaps allow to stem the flow of oil and other forms of logistical support for ISIS. But I think the most important question here is whether Ankara, in your view, could afford to sever its ideological and religious connections to Sunni extremists in Syria, whether it is ISIS or some other groups.
Well, they obviously have got their allies on the ground there. If not ISIS, then there are a couple of other Sunni fanatics, Al-Qaeda related, with whom the Turks unfortunately have been having very close, well, used to have very close relations. I don't know that you can actually seal that border just the same. You can obviously seal the roads, but it's a very long border, and part of it's hilly and all the rest of it, and it would be difficult to screen it, but it was short of deploying about, I should have thought, 100,000 troops.
Well, they have the manpower to do that, but again, the question is whether they really have the commitment of doing it. And I noticed that some of the statements that Turkish officials make about ISIS, they certainly recognize the threat of it. I mean, they have to. I mean, otherwise, it would have been very difficult for them politically. But it seems that they do not necessarily treat it as the type of outrageous, depraved terrorist organization as, for example, it is seen from Washington or even from Moscow.
Yes, and I suppose there's another thing that the Turks would never take seriously those creations like Iraq or even French Syria. That if there's something which is going to eventually break these countries up, then well, so be it. And I think Davutoglu said at some point that we're tearing up Sykes-Picot, the arrangements of 1916, which set these led to the setting up of those countries. And insofar as ISIS says we're a caliphate, I mean, however bizarre they are and brutal, they're in a sense on the Ottoman side.
Well, and in a sense as well, they represent a form of political Islam. Perhaps it's the ugliest version, but political Islam nonetheless, because they have both political and state aspirations. And Mr. Erdogan himself has long been lionized as this flag bearer for political Islam. And I guess that's why he feels so entitled to having an input in whatever happens in Syria. Where do you think the future of what we call political Islam is heading now, given the transformations both within Turkey and around the region? Is that concept still as fashionable as it was a couple of years ago?
It's still very popular in Turkey, as you can see from the elections, and the lack of, well, I was going to say the lack of protest, but protest is so strongly discouraged that that's perhaps the wrong word to use. I mean, I don't think things like that go on forever and ever and ever. They come to an end and explode, and people think, this has all been a fantasy. As it is, if you look at, for instance, the great Catholic revival in the 1870s, 1880s, it eventually petered out, and it's a matter, I think, in the end of generations. And you can see, after all, I mean, name me one Islamic country where a very large part of the young generation does not want to move out. You can see that from the refugees plodding their way to Germany.
But Professor Stone, Turkey was such a country just 5 or 6 years ago. Nobody really wanted to move out. Turks were quite, content with living in their own country 5 years ago.
Oh yes, they were, and it's. I suppose most Turks would rather, but I think the young generation resents this puritanical streak which has taken over since 2009, 2010.
You make a very interesting point in your writing that Turkey already had a very religious and pious leader who nevertheless conducted very sensible, some would even say liberal policies. I'm talking about Turgut Özal here. And what was interesting about him is that in addition to being very religious, he was also an intellectual. He was a university professor. He worked for World Bank. And I think he was perhaps the best example of what Islamic intellectualism has to offer, whereas Mr. Erdogan just used the word intellectuals in a very derogatory sense. He said just this week that, and I'm quoting him here, the old Turkey, where an entire country and nation were being run by a handful of so-called intellectuals, no longer exists. I'm sure you consider yourself to be an intellectual. Doesn't that scare you to hear something like that?
Yes, I mean, one shrugs it aside. You know, he knows that the universities and the educated people are not on his side. And if you listen to ordinary Turks talking about educated microbes, they call us, and he's obviously speaking to some kind of audience. I mean, it's absurd. I'm very worried, actually, about the quality of his advisors. When he used Hitler, of all people, as an illustration for constitutional practice, that must have been some advisor telling him that Hitler had got rid of a federal system in Germany, which he did, more or less, and but he did it by force. And here's this advisor flicking through Wikipedia, not really understanding it, and allowing Erdogan to make that stupid remark about, leading to comparisons with Hitler. I just wonder how on earth he's terribly badly advised at the moment.
Well, but Professor Stone, I mean, I understand that you can shrug or ignore the comments like this easily because, after all, you're a British citizen. But, you know, the speech during which Erdogan made those derogatory comments, he also threatened that academics who speak out against his policies, specifically on the Kurdish issue, may face criminal prosecution, may lose their government positions. And this is something that I think even Americans took notice of, because the American embassy issued a statement. Vice President Biden was supposed to raise an issue. I know that it's challenging enough, we already talked about it, that to try to influence Erdogan's foreign policy vision. Do you think this kind of criticism, human rights criticism, could, press him to modulate his stance domestically?
No, I don't think so. I think he knows he's unpopular in circles like that. The more unpopular he is with people like that, the more popular he is with his own tame constituency, who wouldn't really accept the whole world of human rights at all. Mm-hmm. I don't think it'll worry him for a second. It'll worry a lot of people in the Turkish Foreign Ministry who obviously don't like being unpopular. But I don't think it would worry Erdogan for a second.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking about the Kurdish issue, President Erdogan and the Prime Minister Erdogan heavily criticized President Assad for being heavy-handed, for targeting civilians, or for not treating civilians' lives with enough care and respect while going after the terrorists. And yet, nowadays, we are seeing lots and lots of reports coming out from the southeast of Turkey of civilians being killed in the police shootouts, during police raids. There was a video that surfaced today that supposedly shows police opening up fire on protesters. Is there a danger of...
with the white flag?
Absolutely, yeah. Is there a danger of Mr. Erdogan committing the same sort of mistakes that he previously accused Mr. Assad of?
Ooh. Well, I mean, we obviously are in a situation pretty well of civil war in the southeast now. And in that sense, Syrian circumstances, well, it's a horrible thing to say, but it's not unthinkable. I mean, I think the Turks there are an awful lot of Kurds who are sort of in the middle, who are very embarrassed by the PKK, in fact, hate it. And at the same time, they really feel so close to the Turks. And this is the great question: can Erdogan, as it were, isolate the PKK and develop his own Kurds. And I know they're trying. And in a sense, it's the right thing to do in these circumstances, to try to find some bridge with non-PKK Kurds. The problem is that they've behaved, I have to say, so recklessly in the southeast that they probably have got a very large part of the young generation now just irrationally hating them.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And despite this reckless behavior, as you describe it, it seems that the more recalcitrant the Turkish government becomes, the more concessions they are getting from the West, because they just struck a deal with the European Union on trying to stem the flow of migrants. The European Union also offered some assurances of expediting EU integration. The Americans are treating them with, well, I would argue with kid gloves, despite all the human rights abuses. What do you think about the Western policy, the Western strategy of dealing with the Erdogan government? Is the West likely to get what it wants from Turkey by placating it, or on the contrary, by keeping the pressure up?
Well, I mean, I think in the sense that the Turks have got the demand hand at the moment. You know, they've got these refugees, and they can turn the tap, open the tap, and Greece is defenceless against these floods of refugees, and the Greek government more or less collapsed with it. So Europe's got that problem to look forward to. And that's the first thing. And the second thing is you've got to get the Turks to collaborate militarily over Syria and to some extent Iraq. So the Turks have got the demand hand. I mean, there's one thing that is right. I mean, and you'll know what I mean. Professional class Turks, businessmen, academics, if they were applying for a visa for a European country, faced the most awful, humiliating process. And that obviously should have been got rid of a long time ago. The Americans give educated Turks 10-year visas. The Russians gave, until recently, visa-free entrance. And the Europeans should have done it a long time ago. It was just silly, that. That was a concession to be made. I mean, what happens about Turkey joining Europe? Well, the question is, will there be a Europe for Turkey to join?
Well, I think, yeah, absolutely. The question is whether not just Turkey, but the European Union survived till that glorious moment. Well, anyway, we have to leave it there. I really appreciate your being on the show.
Well, I enjoyed that.
And to our viewers, please share your thoughts on our Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube pages. And I hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.